The valley was a promise that demanded a steep price. Carved into the high granite shoulders of the continent, it offered rich soil in its bottomlands and timbered slopes that climbed to the clouds. But the promise of summer was always paid for by the brutal currency of winter. In the autumn of 1888, the old hands of Providence Valley felt a familiar, unwelcome tremor in their bones. The aspens had turned a frantic, fiery yellow and shed their leaves in a single weekend. The elk came down from the high country a month early, their coats thick and shaggy. The wind, even in September, had a serrated edge that spoke of profound, deep cold to come. For the dozen or so families homesteading the valley, this was the season of preparation, a grim ritual of stockpiling against the inevitable siege. They were a people defined by a philosophy of overwhelming force. Their cabins were built of massive interlocking logs, chinked with mud and moss. Their stone fireplaces were cavernous, designed to devour cords of wood in a relentless battle against the cold. Survival was measured in visible, quantifiable assets: the height of a woodshed's stack, the breadth of a bull's shoulders, the number of jars lining a cellar shelf. And then there was Elias Thorne. He was not related to Jedediah Thorne, the valley's patriarch and founder, a fact Jedediah made clear to any newcomer who made the mistaken assumption. Elias was an outsider in every sense. He had arrived the previous spring, a quiet, lean man with sorrow-haunted eyes, leading a single milk cow and a mule laden with his late wife's belongings. He had bought the old Miller claim, a piece of land at the far end of the valley that everyone else considered unlucky. It was too exposed to the north wind, they said, and the soil was thin and rocky up against the hillside. But what truly set Elias apart was not his quiet grief or his unfortunate choice of land. It was his work. While other men were felling the thickest trees they could find, Elias was selecting smaller, straighter lodgepole pines. While they were building sprawling cabins with broad, welcoming porches, Elias was digging. All summer, the sound of his shovel and pickaxe had echoed faintly across the valley floor. He was a man possessed by the earth itself. First, he dug the foundation for his cabin, sinking it deeper than anyone deemed necessary, lining the pit with a meticulous arrangement of river stones. Then, he did the same for a small barn, placing it some 50 feet up the gentle slope from the cabin site. The placement seemed nonsensical to the practical men of the valley. It was an inconvenient distance, an uphill haul for water, a foolish separation of home and livestock. But the strangest thing of all was what came next. After the foundations were laid, he did not stop digging. He began to excavate a trench between the two sunken pits, a tunnel. It became a source of quiet amusement, then open mockery. Silas Croft, the master builder who had overseen the construction of nearly every structure in the valley, rode out to the Miller claim one August afternoon with Jedediah Thorne at his side. They found Elias waist-deep in the trench, his shirt stained with sweat and clay, methodically prying a stubborn rock loose with a long iron bar. "Thorne," Jedediah said, his voice carrying the weight of unquestioned authority. He stayed on his horse, looking down. "What is the meaning of this burrow?" Elias paused, wiping his brow with the back of a dirty hand. He looked up at them, his pale eyes squinting in the sun. "It's a passage, between the cabin and the barn." Silas Croft let out a short, barking laugh. He was a thick, powerful man whose hands looked like gnarled oak burls. "A passage? For what? Afraid of a little snow on your boots? A man walks to his barn. He faces the wind. That is the way." "It is part of the design," Elias said simply, his voice low and even. He offered no further explanation. "The design?" Croft scoffed, gesturing around at the modest pits and the pile of slender logs. "I see no design here. I see a man wasting the good summer months digging a mole hole while the rest of us are putting up honest timber. That cabin of yours, the logs are no thicker than my arm. And the barn? It's hardly big enough for a decent sow, let alone that sad-looking cow of yours." Jedediah's gaze was colder, more analytical. "The boy is right, Elias. Winter in this valley is not a thing to be trifled with. It is a beast. It requires strength, mass, a fortress of wood and a mountain of fuel. This is folly. Woman's folly." The words hung in the air. They both knew Elias's wife, Anya, had died of a fever on the trail just before they reached the valley. They knew her books and journals were all he had left of her. To them, this strange subterranean project was a symptom of his grief, a madness born of loss. He was clinging to some foolish notion from whatever strange, foreign land his wife had come from. "I will see this through," Elias said. It was not a challenge, but a statement of fact. "See it through to a frozen corpse, then," Silas muttered, turning his horse. Jedediah lingered a moment longer. "Listen to me, son. I founded this settlement. I lost a child to the winter of '76. I know what it takes to survive here. Abandon this foolishness. Build a proper cabin. I will even spare some of my men to help you raise it before the first snow. Do not let your grief build your tomb." It was, for Jedediah, an act of profound charity, an offer to save the fool from himself. "I thank you for the offer, Mr. Thorne," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. "But the design is sound." Jedediah shook his head, a look of pity and frustration on his face. "So be it." He rode away, and the two men did not look back. They had delivered their verdict. Elias Thorne was a lost cause, a man digging his own grave, one shovelful at a time. The story of Elias's folly became a cautionary tale told over evening fires, a bit of local folklore in the making. Elias heard the verdict in their silence, in the way they averted their eyes when he came to the small trading post for supplies. He felt it in the solitude that was no longer just about his grief, but about his purpose. He was alone, utterly and completely. But he was not without guidance. Every night, by the light of a flickering tallow lamp in his temporary lean-to, he would open one of Anya's journals. Her presence filled the small space. She had not been an architect or an engineer by trade, but the daughter of a long line of alpine farmers from a corner of the world where mountains were harsher and winters longer than anything the men of Providence Valley could imagine. Her people had learned not to fight the cold with brute force, but to deceive it, to borrow its own strength and turn it against itself. Her journals were a tapestry of this ancestral knowledge, woven together with a keen, observant understanding of the laws of the natural world. The pages were filled with delicate, precise sketches, elegant handwriting, and calculations that mapped the flow of heat and air. "The earth is a blanket," she had written. "In the deepest winter, when the air is a knife, the ground just 4 feet below the frost line holds a steady, gentle warmth. Not a fire's heat, but the absence of cold. This is the first gift. Do not build upon the earth, build within it." This was the principle behind the sunken foundations. By lowering the floors of his cabin and barn 3 feet below grade, he was placing the heart of his home below the reach of the wind and the deepest frost. The earth itself would insulate him. And the tunnel. The men saw a coward's passage. Anya's journals described it as the artery of a living system. The lung, she called it in her notes. "The beasts are a furnace," she wrote on another page, alongside a drawing of a cow placidly chewing its cud. "Every breath they take releases warmth and moisture. In a conventional barn, this is a waste product, vented away to prevent sickness. But it is energy. It is life. It must not be squandered. The warm, moist air is lighter than the cold, dry air of winter. It wishes to rise. Let it. The tunnel was not level. It sloped gently, almost imperceptibly, downward from the barn to the cabin. Elias spent weeks lining the passage. He did not have the cut stone of Anya's homeland, so he improvised. He painstakingly hauled flat stones from the creek bed, fitting them together for the floor. For the walls and ceiling, he built a sturdy frame of lodgepole pine, creating a box-like structure within the earthen trench. He then packed the space between the timber frame and the earth walls with a thick, insulating layer of dry moss and pine needles, before finally covering the entire structure with the excavated dirt, burying it completely. He left only 2 openings, which would become the doors at either end. He was not just building a tunnel, he was building an insulated, subterranean conduit. As autumn deepened, he worked on the structures themselves. The cabin walls rose, the slender logs chinked not with mud, but with a mixture of clay, sand, and sawdust that Anya had detailed, a compound that would dry harder and resist cracking far better than the local method. He built a fireplace, but it was small, compact, and made of soapstone he had found in a distant outcropping. Its core was a heavy iron firebox he had hauled all the way from the railhead, surrounded by a massive, carefully constructed chimney of river stones. The locals, used to their walk-in hearths, would have laughed at its diminutive size. But Anya's sketches showed the physics of it. The great hearth is a thief, she explained. It warms the man in front of it by stealing the heated air from the rest of the room and sending it up the chimney. A room with a large fire is a room with a dozen hidden drafts. The goal is not to create a great fire, but to capture and hold its heat. The soapstone and river rocks around Elias's small firebox were not just a chimney. They were a thermal battery. The small, hot fire would heat the dense mass of stone, and that stone would then radiate a slow, steady, even heat back into the room for hours, long after the fire itself had died to embers. The windows were small and few, with only one larger, south-facing window to capture the low winter sun. The north wall had no windows at all, only the solid, insulated timber. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow with long eaves. Every element was a quiet conversation with the physics of heat and cold. Section-section. In the barn, he did the same. The structure was small, but it was a fortress of insulation. He built a clever ventilation system Anya had designed, a wooden shaft that ran from the highest point of the barn ceiling, down through the wall, and into the tunnel itself. A second, smaller intake vent was positioned near the floor of the barn. The theory was simple, but profound. The body heat from his cow, his mule, and a small flock of chickens would warm the air inside the sealed barn. This warm, moist air, being lighter, would rise to the ceiling. Instead of escaping outside, it would be drawn into the ventilation shaft and channeled into the high end of the tunnel. Gravity and temperature would do the rest. The warm, buoyant air would flow gently down the insulated slope of the tunnel toward the cabin. As it traveled the 50-foot passage, the Earth's constant temperature would cool it slightly, wringing out the excess moisture, which would condense on the stone floor and drain away into a small sump Elias had dug. By the time it reached the cabin, it would be a current of fresh, dry, and pre-warmed air. This current would feed the small fireplace, providing a constant, stable source of oxygen without creating cold drafts. The displaced air in the cabin would then exit through a dedicated vent in the chimney, completing the circuit. The entire system, cabin, tunnel, barn, was designed to be a single, closed, breathing organism. A machine for living, powered by the gentle heat of the earth, the breath of his animals, and the thermal mass of stone. The labor was immense, a crushing weight on his solitary frame. His hands, once soft from a life spent more with books than with tools, became calloused and split. His back ached with a fire that never quite went out. There were days of agonizing frustration, when the rocky soil refused his pickaxe, when a shoring timber slipped, when a sudden rainstorm threatened to collapse his trench. In those moments, despair was a physical presence, a cold hand on his shoulder. He would retreat to the lean-to, light the lamp, and open a journal. He would trace Anya's drawings with a trembling finger, hear her voice in the written words, calm and confident. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Be patient. Be precise. The stone knows where it belongs. The log knows its purpose. Listen to them. And he would find the strength to continue. He was not just building a shelter. He was finishing a conversation with his wife. He was honoring her wisdom against a world that had dismissed it as folly. By late October, as the first stinging flurries of snow swirled down from the peaks, the work was done. The cabin was small, almost humble from the outside. The barn was stout and low, and between them, there was nothing. Just a smooth, regraded patch of earth where the trench had been, now covered with a thin blanket of snow. The folly had disappeared, buried before it could even be properly judged. The valley prepared. Smoke plumed from every chimney, thick and constant. The sound of axes splitting the last of the winter's wood echoed in the sharp, clear air. Men hauled supplies from their root cellars, checked the seals on their windows, and banked their fires high against the coming night. They looked toward the end of the valley, toward the lonely curl of smoke rising from Elias Thorne's strange little cabin, and they shook their heads. He hadn't even put up a proper woodshed. The man had perhaps half a cord of wood stacked against his cabin wall. It was a week's supply, at best. The first week of November, the sky turned the color of lead. The air grew still and heavy, pregnant with a silence that was more menacing than any wind. The temperature plummeted. The old-timers called it a weather breeder, a sign of something terrible on the way. They called it the White Siege. It did not begin with a roar, but with a whisper. Soft, fat flakes drifting down, lazily at first, then with a growing, relentless purpose. Within hours, the valley was shrouded in white. By the next morning, a foot had fallen, and it did not stop. The whisper became a hiss, and the hiss became a roar as the wind rose, a monstrous gale out of the north that tore at the cabins and sculpted the endless snow into terrifying, mountainous drifts. For 3 days, it snowed without pause. The world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Visibility was reduced to zero. The very concept of direction ceased to exist. To step outside was to be instantly blinded, suffocated, and thrown off balance by the sheer force of the blizzard. The people of Providence Valley were prisoners in their own homes. Inside Jedediah Thorne's large, well-built cabin, the battle was joined. His fireplace, the largest in the valley, was a source of pride. Now it was a ravenous beast. It cast a cheerful, dancing light, but it was a lie. Anyone standing more than 10 feet away felt the insidious chill of the drafts it created. The massive log walls, which had seemed so impenetrable, were bleeding heat. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the chinking, radiating from the window panes, which were coated on the inside with a thick, crystalline tracery of frost. They burned through wood at an astonishing rate. By the 4th day, the generous supply stacked on the porch was gone. Jedediah and his 2 grown sons, Jacob and Samuel, attempted to reach the main woodshed, a mere 30 yards from the cabin. They opened the door and were met with a solid wall of snow. It took them an hour of brutal, exhausting work to tunnel just 10 feet. The snow was not light and fluffy. It was packed hard by the wind, heavy as wet sand. The wind drove the snow back into their faces, stinging their eyes and stealing their breath. They were fighting a battle they could not win. The more they dug, the more the blizzard filled the trench behind them. They retreated, gasping, their beards and clothes frozen solid, having failed to even reach the halfway point. The same drama was playing out in every home. The valley's strength, its massive cabins and huge wood piles, had become its weakness. The cabins were impossible to heat efficiently, and the wood piles were inaccessible, buried under 15 feet of snow and shifting drifts. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and cold. They burned furniture. They burned fence posts they managed to wrench free from the porch. They rationed food. The temperature inside the cabins dropped to near freezing. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dim, cold air. The livestock, trapped in their barns, began to die. Their desperate, weakening cries were swallowed by the endless howl of the wind. On the 8th day of the siege, the snow finally stopped. The prize bull in his barn, the symbol of his wealth and status, was surely dead by now. Desperation gnawed at him, and with it, a strange, nagging thought. A memory of a quiet man digging a trench. A fool, they had all called him. A man who had built a flimsy-looking cabin with a tiny fireplace and almost no wood. Elias Thorne was certainly dead. He must have frozen in the first 2 days. His cabin, sunken into the ground, would be a snow-filled tomb by now. And yet, the thought became an obsession. It was an irrational sliver of hope in a hopeless situation, the kind of madness that takes root in a man's mind when he is at the end of his rope. He had to know. He had to see the fool's frozen monument for himself. Perhaps, by some miracle, Elias had a few scraps of wood left. A single meal. Anything. "I'm going out," he announced, his voice a harsh croak in the silent room. His son Jacob grabbed his arm. "Father, no! It's death out there! You won't make it 100 yards." "We're dying in here," Jedediah rasped, pulling his arm free. "Slowly. I'm going to the Miller place." The statement was met with stunned silence. The Miller place? The fool's claim? It was over a mile away, across drifts that were likely 30 feet high in places. It was suicide. But they saw the look in his eyes, a wild, desperate resolve. He spent a half-hour preparing, layering on every piece of wool and fur he possessed. He fashioned crude snowshoes from barrel staves. He took no food or water, for there was none to spare. He was a man embarking on his own funeral march. The journey was a nightmare. The cold was a living thing, an entity that clawed at him, seeking any gap in his clothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the squeaking crunch of his snowshoes on the brutally cold snow. The landscape was alien, unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks, fences, sheds, even entire groves of trees had vanished beneath the monolithic white blanket. He navigated by instinct, by the position of the pale, useless sun, and by the faint outline of the highest ridges. He fell a dozen times, plunging into hidden hollows, the snow swallowing him up to his chest. Each time, it took a universe of effort to claw his way back to the surface. His lungs burned. His heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of his family, freezing in the dark cabin, and he pushed on. He thought of Elias Thorne, the quiet fool, and he cursed him for this insane quest. After what felt like a lifetime, he rounded the last ridge and saw it. He saw the Miller claim, and he stopped, his mind refusing to process the scene before him. The cabin was there, its steep roof a dark triangle against the snow. It was half buried, as expected, but rising from its stone chimney was a thin, almost invisible plume of heat haze. Not smoke, just a gentle, steady shimmer of warmth against the crystalline air. From a small hooded pipe sticking out of the snow near the barn, a similar wisp of steam rose. And then he heard it. A sound so impossible, so alien in this dead, frozen world, that he thought his mind had finally broken. The low, contented moo of a cow. He stumbled forward, his exhausted body suddenly charged with a disbelieving energy. He floundered through the last drift and collapsed against the cabin door, hammering on it with a frozen fist. The wood was not cold. He pulled his glove off, pressing his bare hand against it. It was faintly warm. He heard movement inside, a wooden bar being lifted. The door swung inward. Elias Thorne stood before him. He was not dressed in furs. He wore a simple wool shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbows. His face was calm. Behind him, Jedediah could see the cabin's interior, bathed in a soft, steady light from a lantern. The air that flowed out of the doorway was not the frigid, dead air of a tomb. It was warm. It smelled of hay, of cedar, of healthy livestock, and, impossibly, of fresh bread. Jedediah stared, speechless. He could not reconcile the reality of this warm, living place with the frozen hell he had just traversed. "How?" he finally whispered, the word a painful rasp from his raw throat. Elias's expression held no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn understanding. "Come in, Mr. Thorne. You are freezing." He led the older man inside and sat him on a stool near the soapstone hearth. The stones radiated a deep, penetrating warmth that felt like life itself seeping back into Jedediah's frozen limbs. The air was fresh and clean, with none of the stale, smoky odor of a cabin sealed for a week. He looked around. A small loaf of bread was cooling on a rack. A pot of something simmered gently on the small iron stovetop built into the stone mass. It was a scene of impossible domestic peace. Your animals?" Jedediah stammered. "I heard your cow." "They are well," Elias said. He handed Jedediah a tin mug of hot, weak tea. "Come, I will show you." He lit another lantern and led Jedediah not to the main door, but to a low, sturdy-looking door in the back wall of the cabin, one that Jedediah hadn't even noticed. Elias lifted the latch, and Jedediah was met not with a wall of snow, but with a dark opening, a passage, the tunnel. They stepped through. The air inside was warmer than the cabin and humid. It smelled richly of earth and hay. The stone floor was dry, and the timbered walls were free of frost. Lanterns hung from hooks every 10 feet, casting a steady, golden glow. It was not a damp, miserable burrow. It was a clean, dry, functional corridor, a lifeline. As they walked, Elias explained, "The barn is slightly uphill. The body heat from the animals rises. I channel it into the tunnel here. The earth's warmth keeps the passage from freezing. By the time the air reaches the cabin, it is cooled a little, but it's still far warmer than the air outside. It feeds the fire. No drafts." They reached the other end and emerged into the barn. The sight stunned Jedediah into silence for a second time. The barn was a haven of warmth and life. Elias's milk cow and mule stood calmly in their stalls, chewing hay. A half-dozen chickens scratched in a clean bed of straw. The air was thick with the heat of their bodies, a living furnace that powered the entire system. A large cistern in the corner, fed by a clever gutter system Elias had built before the storm, was full of melted snow, providing ample water. He had mountains of hay and feed, all accessible, all protected. Elias had not been fighting the winter. He had harnessed it. He had captured the waste heat of his animals, borrowed the insulation of the earth, and used the principles of convection to create a self-sustaining, closed loop of survival. His small, efficient fireplace only needed a few logs a day to keep the thermal mass of the stones charged. His meager woodpile was not a sign of foolishness, but of profound efficiency. He had enough to last for another month. It was not folly, it was genius. A quiet, humble, devastating genius that laid bare the ignorance of Jedediah's entire philosophy of life. All his strength, his massive logs, his roaring fires, it was all brute force, stupid and wasteful. He had tried to punch the winter into submission. Elias had simply stepped aside and let its own weight defeat it. Jedediah Thorne, patriarch of the valley, the man of iron will and unshakable confidence, leaned against a wooden post and wept. He wept for his foolish pride, for his dying family, for the child he'd lost to a winter long ago, a death that might have been prevented. He wept for his own profound, staggering ignorance. "My wife, Martha, she is sick," he choked out. "The children, we have no more wood. We are freezing." Elias placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Then we must bring them here." There was no more talk of folly. The tunnel became an ark. The journey back to Jedediah's cabin was a blur of grim purpose. Elias, conditioned by his summer of labor, was strong. He helped Jedediah clear a path, not by digging, but by showing him how to pack the snow, creating a firmer trench. They brought back Jedediah's family, his wife, his sons, their wives, the grandchildren. They carried Martha on a makeshift sled. The small cabin was crowded, but it was warm. It was alive. Elias shared his food, his water, his warmth, without a single word of reproach. He was not a savior gloating over the vanquished. He was simply a man doing what was necessary. Over the next few days, Elias's cabin became the heart of the frozen valley. Guided by Jedediah's sons, they made perilous journeys to the other homesteads, rescuing family after family from their frozen, silent cabins. Silas Croft, the master builder, was found near death, his powerful hands blue with frostbite, his family huddled around the last dying embers of their shattered dining table. He was carried through the snow and into the warmth of the burrow he had mocked. He could not meet Elias's eyes. For another week, the white siege held the valley in its grip. But inside the impossible cabin, a community was reborn. They survived on Elias's stores and the milk from his cow. They found strength not in individual fortitude, but in shared humility. They saw firsthand how the elegant, simple system worked. They felt the steady, radiant heat of the stones. They walked the warm, dry tunnel. They tended the animals whose breath was keeping them all alive. When the siege finally broke, and a rescue party from the lower towns dug their way into the valley, they found a scene of devastation. Ruined homes, lost livestock, and a community brought to its knees. But they also found that not a single soul had been lost. They had all been saved by the very man they had condemned. The spring that followed was a season of profound change in Providence Valley. There was no formal apology to Elias Thorne. Words were not their way. Instead, the apology was written on the land itself. The sound of digging returned to the valley. But this time, it was not one man. It was every man. Silas Croft, his hands still bandaged, was the first to come to Elias, not with mockery, but with a builder's slate and a piece of charcoal. "Show me," he said, his voice thick with humility. "Show me the drawings, the design." Elias did not hoard his knowledge. He shared Anya's journals freely. He walked from claim to claim, explaining the principles of thermal mass, of passive solar orientation, of insulated ventilation. He taught them how to work with the land, not against it, how to see the earth as a blanket, the sun as an ally, and their animals as partners in survival. That summer, the architecture of Providence Valley was remade. New cabins were sunk into the earth, barns were moved and rebuilt, and between every home and its outbuildings, a telltale scar of fresh earth marked the path of a newly dug tunnel. They were no longer called Elias's Folly. They were called Anya's Passages. Elias Thorne, the quiet widower, the grieving outsider, became the most respected man in the valley. He never sought power or authority. He did not have to. He had something more potent, the quiet confidence of proven wisdom. He had honored his wife's memory not by building a cold stone monument, but by breathing life into her knowledge, creating a legacy that would shelter generations to come. The valley was still a promise that demanded a price, but its people had finally learned how to pay it, not with brute force, but with grace, humility, and a deep understanding of the elegant, unyielding laws of the world. And in the harshest winters, when the wind howled and the snow buried the world, the people of the valley would walk the warm, lighted passages beneath the frost, safe in the knowledge that the greatest strength is not always found in what is seen, but in the quiet, interconnected wisdom that lies just beneath the surface.